Hello all, let's go over some important vocabulary and terms you need to know for this evolution unit and a little intro onto some of those key terms and understandings. First off, we need to jump into what evolution is. Evolution is an idea of how organisms have changed and will continue to change. So all evolution is a gradual change over time. It's nothing big or miraculous or insanely complicated. There are two types of evolution. There's a microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is the one we're going to be focusing on for this unit. Microevolution is the change of phenotype in one species. So the species stays the same, but the phenotype changes. So for instance, say a new population of rabbits have slightly longer ears, or a new population of regular American house cats has slightly longer tails. Still the same species. However, there is a change that is new to the population. We actually have traits that pop up all the time that show signs of microevolution. We have one that came out recently called the super sleeper gene, which allows some people to go 5 hours with 5 hours of sleep and not need any more. They're completely, totally perky, happy, and awake. 5 hours of sleep, regardless of what they've done that day. Macroevolution, however, is the development of a new species. So this is the change from amphibian to reptile, or reptile to bird, or reptile to mammal, or mammal to more complex mammal. And this one we are not going to be covering so heavily in this class. We have more time for microevolution, which sets the foundation for macroevolution. So the most important points of this whole unit is this is not an overnight change. It is a change in population. Individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve. And it is a gradual, slow change. Natural selection is that process. So evolution is the foreground idea, and natural selection is how it occurs. So let's jump into some more terms. Let's look at natural selection. Natural selection is the process in which a specific organism in the population that are best designed for that environment and are better able to reproduce than other organisms in the same population. So they are the ones that, when they are born, they have the genes that allow them to survive the best in that environment. If their environment changes, no longer a good advantage. But these are the organisms that at that moment have been born to survive the best in the environment and reproduce. So whether it be the fastest runners, the best swimmers, the most attractive plumage, the most intelligent, it really depends on the environment and that organism and that species. If you look to the image on the PowerPoint, you will notice a somewhat gray, black and white image, and you can at least see one dark moth in there. Most of you should be able to pick out the second moth in the picture, despite the fact the coloration is not the same. Also, based on this image, you could probably give an estimation on which moth is going to survive based on its background in the image. Hopefully you were able to find both moths. They're here and here. And natural selection is going to pick the one that's going to survive the best in its environment. And if its environment is that lightly peppery colored tree bark, that light pepper moth is going to be the one to survive. Now, this is a great case study because in England and parts of Europe, there were trees that had a white peppery bark to them. And there were these moths. One phenotype of the moth had that white peppery coloration, and one was dark. Now, during this time, the white peppery moths were incredibly prolific. There were more of them than the dark pepper moths. The dark pepper moths would be picked off and eaten very quickly. The light pepper moths would be able to blend in and hide better from birds and other things that would try and eat them, until the Industrial Revolution came along. When that happened, there was a bunch of factories in the surrounding forests that spewed out tons of coal and soot into the air, covering the trees in a thick black dust and powder. Which of the two now would be able to survive in that sort of situation? New environment, new natural selection. If you thought correctly, the dark moths would have survived and the white ones would stick out. Therefore, natural selection would curve to determine who is going to survive, and that would affect evolution in the long run if that was the same environment that kept up. So this is actually what it looks like when that coal and soot covered during the Industrial Revolution. So these peppery moths are going to be very easy to spot, and the dark ones are going to blend in much, much better. So it's important to realize that natural selection is an explanation for what's been happening. And Charles Darwin, who you saw in the video and we're going to be talking about in the history portion of this, did not come up with evolution. Evolution was already a theory being thrown around and talked about in science offices and conferences and discussions everywhere. He just figured out the best possible way to explain it using what he had. Another important term to take into context when learning about evolution is competition. Competition drives evolution and natural selection. When organisms are struggling for limited resources, they compete. When there's competition, the better, the stronger, the faster, the smarter, the better camouflaged are going to win, or even the better looking ones, depending on the species. Take a moment. Give me 3 things that animals or organisms compete over. The 3 I have are food, territory, and mates. I want you to now explain how each picture represents the 3 types of competition. So, as you can see, the prairie dog and the birds are fighting over food. So there's a lot of food. They're pulling for berries and seeds. The wolf is marking its territory by urinating on a tree, therefore giving it scent. And the rams are butting heads to try and prove who is the best male for the females. In Darwin's example of competition, his favorite animal to look at for this were the finches. What were the finches competing for? Finches, as you know, were competing for food. And because of this competition, certain finches with certain types of beaks developed over time because there were different niches of food or different groups of food that could be eaten. And so specialization of those beaks occurred, and so competition was reduced. The birds could survive overall. Adaptation is any trait or behavior that makes an organism better to survive and reproduce than the others in that given population. Adaptations are often the result of a mutation in DNA. This can be a behavior or a structure. You are often born with an adaptation. We are born with them. Take a moment and think of a couple of adaptations we have as a species. List one. Now, adaptations don't always grant an organism what they need. It's not meant for what you need. It just helps you overall. Now, when thinking about the human species, maybe you thought about the thumbs, our developed brains, our ability to walk upright. All of those are adaptations. Looking at these pictures, we have an octopus, an anglerfish, and a moth. What are their adaptations? Hopefully you stated that the octopus's adaptation, in this scenario at least, was the ability to spray ink to either scare predators or try to confuse predators or to ensnare prey. The anglerfish, it has that glowing light that attracts its prey. And the moth has those eye spots that look like owl eyes to scare smaller birds away from eating it. The last term we're going to talk about is fitness. Take a moment, look at the two families. Who's more fit? Well, if you use the biological sense of the word fitness in terms of evolution, this guy is, right here, the Duggard family. Fitness is the measure of how many offspring an organism produces. More fit organisms have better traits to survive and reproduce. So it doesn't matter how many kids you have, but you need to have enough kids to survive. So, good example in real life. I have one child. People who have more children than me are more fit, though I am more fit than those who do not have any children, because I have passed on my genetic information. Let's look at an example. Here's 4 different bears of various ages. Listed below is the age of their death, how many offspring they had, and how many grandchildren they had. Now, if we were just looking at the offspring, who's the most fit? If we were looking at the chart as a whole and also took into account the grandchildren, who is the most fit? If we were just looking at the offspring, Charlie, despite the fact he died the youngest, had the most number of children, so he passed on the most genetic information. So he would be the most fit. Grandchildren-wise, Artan had 10 children. For those of you wondering what sort of name is Artan, Artan's actually Irish name that means bear, so fits pretty well. But Artan had the highest number of grandchildren. So he is actually the most fit of them all, because even though he had 3 kids, those 3 kids had a lot of children themselves. And he was the second youngest when he died. So it doesn't matter. He had the most kids. He spread the most genetics around. So those are some important terms looking forward in terms of taking into account, what is happening in evolution. We're going to be using these terms a lot interchangeably over the next few weeks. So just keep track of them best you can. You can review this video. It'll be unlocked as soon as you finish your Edpuzzle. All right, move on to the next.